Well, we talked to homeowners in this Okeechobee County community, and they say the flooding is just terrible. One gentleman tells me he's been fighting for 4 years, and look, he's still not getting any help.
It all started on March 14th, 2024. A wildlife photographer named Marcus Riley was going through drone footage he'd taken at Lake Okeechobee when he saw something so bizarre he had to hit rewind 3 separate times. He noticed these dark patches on parts of the lake bed that had been left exposed, but they weren't in the same place they'd been just 12 hours before. We're not talking about a few inches here. Literally entire acres of ground had slid toward the remaining water. They left behind these massive drag marks in the mud, looking like something huge had just crawled through. Riley mentioned in an interview that he called his colleague over and they both just stared at the screen in total silence for a full minute. This wasn't wildlife and it wasn't just normal erosion. It was actually the bottom of Florida's biggest lake waking up after being still for decades. And the scariest part? What's buried in that lake bed is tied directly to the drinking water for 8 million people. The massive, quiet drawdown. Here's the thing, Florida didn't exactly announce with a lot of noise. Between November 2023 and April 2024, water managers quietly drained over 400 billion gallons of water from Lake Okeechobee. There was no hurricane, no massive drought, and no emergency. It was just a scheduled drawdown they'd approved months early. Just think about that number. 400 billion gallons. That's enough to fill 600,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And it was gone in just 5 months. To most people in Florida, the lake just looked a little smaller. But Dr. Patricia Vance, who researches sediment at Florida Atlantic University, was seeing something much more serious. She'd been tracking satellite images of the lake bed for 3 years. And when she compared January to March, she immediately told her supervisor, "You need to see this right now." Vance saw ground movement, not just water. You see, Lake Okeechobee is actually really shallow, averaging 9 feet and sometimes only 6. When you drop the water by 4 feet across 730 square miles, you aren't just moving water, you're basically lifting a compression blanket that has kept the lake floor held down for generations. And that's when it got creepy. The lake bed didn't just sit there to dry, it started to slide. The fisherman's warning. A local fishing guide named Tommy Bonitez, who's worked on Okeechobee for 22 years, was one of the first to realize something was off. By late February, he was out on his usual route near Observation Shoal. He saw the water was low, which he'd seen before, but the bottom looked totally wrong. He saw channels that weren't there the week before and ridges pushed up where it used to be completely flat. He said he'd never seen the lake rearrange itself like that. But what Bonitez saw from his boat was really just the surface of the problem. The real story was still hidden underneath. The safe paper decisions. Now, every big water decision in South Florida goes through the South Florida Water Management District. On paper, this whole drawdown looked like a standard, textbook procedure. A spokesperson for the district, Jennifer Kowalski, told the press they were just managing for structural safety and future capacity because the Herbert Hoover decay needs these periodic adjustments. She sounded very calm and reassuring. But get this. When a local reporter asked if they'd factored sediment disturbance into the schedule, Kowalski paused for 4 whole seconds before saying they monitor multiple variables, and that sediment behavior is just one of many things they consider. That pause really said more than her words did. Official documents say the goals are to reduce pressure on the old dike system, create storage for hurricane season, and help the shoreline zones recover. That all sounds fine and follows protocol, but there's a catch. Those protocols are decades old. They assume the lake bed is stable and that sediment stays put. Dr. Vance disagrees, saying the models they use are based on the 1990s. But the lake has changed. The muck layer on the bottom isn't the same as it was 30 years ago, yet they are using the same old playbook that doesn't account for removing 4 feet of water in under 5 months. The evidence on camera. Early in February, Marcus Riley had actually set up time-lapse cameras at 4 different spots around the lake. His original goal was just to document bird migrations, but what he ended up catching was the very first visual evidence that the entire foundation of Lake Okeechobee was no longer stable. Between March 18th and March 21st, his cameras captured these massive dark masses migrating across the parts of the lake bed that were now exposed. They weren't just drifting, they were physically migrating, moving at an average speed of 15 to 20 feet every single day toward the water that was left. They left behind these very distinct drag patterns that went on for hundreds of yards. Riley explained that at first, he thought it might be some kind of optical illusion, like moving shadows. So, he started marking fixed reference points, things like a dead tree stump or a piece of fixed debris. When he looked at the images side by side on his laptop, the fixed objects stayed exactly where they were, but everything around them was sliding. It looked like the entire floor of the lake was on a tilt that nobody could actually see. The uncorked substrate. Dr. Raymond Chen, a geomorphologist who consults for the Army Corps of Engineers, took a look at Riley's footage in April. His take on it was pretty blunt. He said this is not how sediment is supposed to behave. Usually, mud just dries out and cracks. It doesn't migrate sideways at a speed like this. He concluded that we are looking at mass movement, where the ground itself is acting like a thick, viscous fluid under its own weight. But here's where it gets even crazier. When Chen asked for sediment cores from the areas that were sliding, the results changed the entire conversation. Previous surveys suggested the muck layer was maybe 3 feet deep. These new samples showed it was actually 9 feet deep, and in some spots, it reached 11 feet. We're talking about decades of agricultural runoff, rotting plants, fish waste, and phosphorus deposits that had built up a foundation way thicker than anyone had ever mapped. That entire foundation had been held down by the weight of the water for so long that when they took that pressure away, it triggered something that had never been modeled. Chen said once he saw those core samples, he understood it immediately. They hadn't just lowered the water, they had uncorked something. A 40-year time capsule. This is what most people don't get about Lake Okeechobee. It's not just a body of water, it's a 40-year environmental time capsule. Ever since the 1980s, big farming operations around the lake have been sending nutrient-rich runoff straight into it. Phosphorus, nitrogen, and fertilizer residue have been settling to the bottom year after year, piling up in that muck layer. Because of the weight of the water, all that stuff stayed locked in place, hidden away and out of the water supply. But then Dr. Patricia Vance ran chemical tests on the sediment samples from March 2024. What she found was so shocking, she had to ask for a second round of tests just to be sure the numbers were right. The phosphorus levels in the muck that was moving measured 1,840 parts per million. To give you some context, anything over 500 parts per million is considered ecologically dangerous. The samples she tested were nearly 4 times that limit. Vance warned in a briefing that this isn't just mud, it's a nutrient bomb that's been building for 40 years, and now it's on the move. Just think about that. 4 decades of pollution, once sealed under the water, is now sliding toward the remaining lake and the canal systems that provide water to 8 million people. When that muck shifts, it doesn't just move to a new spot, it releases everything. The phosphorus that was trapped in the sediment becomes active again, enters the water, and starts fueling massive algae blooms. Tommy Benitez saw the first signs of this in late March when the water near Clewiston started turning green way earlier than it should have. That bloom wasn't supposed to happen until June, but something kicked it off months early. When local problems go global, you have to realize that Lake Okeechobee doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It is the literal heart of a massive canal network that feeds water to cities, massive farms, and entire ecosystems all over South Florida. Whatever happens in that lake definitely does not stay in that lake. By April 2024, water treatment plants in Palm Beach and Martin counties were already seeing a 23% spike in filtration costs compared to the same time last year. The algae loads were much heavier and the water was much cloudier. Systems that usually handle spring conditions were being pushed to their absolute limits. One water utility manager, speaking off the record, said they budget for seasonal changes, but this was something else entirely, and they are watching the numbers very closely. The price residents are paying. So, what do those numbers actually mean for you? Well, those higher treatment costs get passed right down to the people. By May, utility bills in the affected counties had gone up by an average of $14 per month. That might not sound like a huge deal at first, but when you multiply that by 1.2 million households, you start to see just how massive the scale is. The impact on agriculture is a bit harder to put a dollar sign on yet, but it's already happening. Irrigation water with these high nutrient levels messes with soil chemistry over time. By late April, Farmers in the Glades region were already seeing weird algae growth in their drainage ditches, and nobody is sure yet what the final crop yields are going to look like this season. And here is the part that nobody really wants to mention. The muck is still moving. Dr. Chen's latest analysis from May showed that the sediment hasn't stabilized. Everyone assumed that once the water dropped to a certain point, the sliding would slow down, but it hasn't. The material is still consolidating and sliding toward the low points, and we don't even have a reliable model to tell us when it will stop. The question isn't just about what has already shifted. It's about what happens when that water finally comes back. A return that solves nothing. The officials are basically counting on one thing, that the summer rains will raise the lake levels again, flood those exposed areas, and make the surface look normal. For most of the public, that will be the end of the story. But Dr. Vance isn't buying it. She says people assume that if the water returns, the conditions return to normal. But that isn't how these lake systems work. The muck has already been redistributed, and the phosphorus has already been mobilized. When you cover that stuff with water again, you aren't resetting the clock, you are just adding fuel to a chemical reaction that has already started. The history books back her up on this. After a similar drawdown in 2008, algae blooms downstream actually increased by 40% over the next 2 years. Water treatment costs went through the roof, and the fishing industry lost more than $20 million. And keep in mind, that drawdown was even smaller than the one we are seeing now. The troubling truth. Tommy Bonitez has been out on this lake long enough to see the cycle. He says every time they drain it and fill it back up, it comes back a little different and a little worse. He's starting to think it's not management, it's just damage that they haven't figured out how to measure yet. The really disturbing truth here is that Lake Okeechobee isn't broken. It is just responding the way a stress system always does when you remove the pressure holding it together too quickly. That muck layer didn't just appear out of nowhere. It took 40 years to build up. No amount of fiddling with the water level is going to make it just go away. What Riley's footage showed us this spring isn't some glitch or malfunction, it's a consequence. So, here is the big question that nobody in Tallahassee is willing to answer. If the very foundation of Florida's biggest lake can shift this much during a routine, planned operation, what on earth happens when a Category 4 hurricane forces an emergency water release? What happens when there's no time for a gradual adjustment? And even more importantly, who was it that decided that messing with 40 years of buried pollution was a risk worth taking for the 8 million people living downstream? Eventually, the water is going to rise again. The cameras will stop recording, and Lake Okeechobee will look perfectly calm on the surface. But now, you know exactly what is moving underneath. Thank you so much for sticking with us all the way to the end. If you found this video helpful, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our daily uploads. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think the plan should be for Lake Okeechobee. And while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our top recommended videos that are popping up on your screen right now. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next one.